Hi, my name is Jim Hayes, and I've owned 1142 since 1975. Welcome to the story about 1142, a house which has been in existence for almost 160 years. 1142 East Court Street in Iowa City. The structure is a simple, classic Italianate design. The house has been lived in and cared for by its owner occupants for all these years. The home is a very warm and welcoming place. It's a testament to friendship and to families. A common theme among all of the owner occupants has been their tie to the soil, their tie to the land. Each family has started on the farm. Each family has revered education. Each of the owners have left the farm and have gone other ways in life. Nicholas Oakes came from Germany to America, then to Iowa, left the farm and became a brickmaker. Grant Wood left the farm and became a teacher and a famous artist. Dr. Pauline Moore left the farm and became one of the first prominent women physicians in Iowa City and lived here with her husband, Ed Milner. I left the farm and became a trial lawyer. So now let's start the story of 1142.
I have heard all my life growing up with stories of Nicholas and his house he built in Iowa City and the family that lived around him and the way his life unfolded, which is in many ways kind of a classic American story.
A family came here from Ohio, Nicholas Oakes and his wife Mary and their first child Hiram. The Oakes family was from Germany originally.
We've discovered that he actually came to America in 1830 with his parents sailing on a ship from Germany. He was only 2 years old at that time and one of 7 children.
This is one of the early waves of immigration into the United States from a part of the world where you had folks, there was a lot of tumult, a lot of political uncertainty, and you had folks looking for a better life and more stability in the New World.
When his parents, Mr. and Mrs. Valentine Oakes, crossed the Atlantic Ocean in 1830, they were aboard an ancient steamship that laboriously battled with the waves and crawled snakingly over and plowingly through the breakers for 7 long weeks. The future Iowa City brickmaker and his elders did not come directly to Iowa City after their boat docked on American shores. Instead, they first viewed Philadelphia before moving to Ohio.
A little bit east of Canton, where they hack out the woods and set out this farm like a lot of folks were doing at that time, Ohio being pretty much the western frontier of the country.
Nicholas' days of youth were filled with the typical duties of farm life. He attended school and was said to be, quote, better fitted than the average youth, both by reason of his early days of labor and his education to make his own way in the world, unquote.
At some point, he decides or is led to this apprenticeship with the brickmaker. Not sure whether that was his interest or whether that just seemed a logical thing to do. He had an aptitude for that. Certainly it caught with him and led to his later career.
He sought out on his own at age 19 and began working for a brick manufactory owned by George Williams and Brothers. He learned the trade and after 5 years moved to Massillon, Ohio. When Nicholas Oakes was still living in Ohio near his parents, he met Mary Schaefer.
My great-grandfather and my great-grandmother Mary were married, it's my recollection, March 23rd, 1853.
Nicholas and Mary moved to Iowa City, Iowa in 1855.
As soon as people arrived, they needed houses better than the initial log and frame buildings, some of them rather crude, that they built. And to do that, you need bricks, and there was a wonderful supply of clay in an area directly across the street.
They first bought the homestead property where 1142 is now located, and they bought property across Court Street where the brick factory was located. Started making bricks right away, and they completed the house then in 1858. And so the little stone over the doorway shows in Oaks, 1858.
Nicholas Oakes was a man of capital. He was obviously more affluent than many of his contemporaries because he was able to invest in the establishment of this factory. It seems when you look at the 1868-1869 city directory and look at the occupations of the residents of Iowa City, it seems like 1 in 10 practically are employed by Nicholas Oakes in one manner or another.
Bricks were made in the factory south of 1142, but were fired in kilns along Court Street.
And undoubtedly, this was a marvelous piece of promotion for his own company. Lovely Italianate brick house in what was then more or less a suburb or an outskirt of the city would have been a wonderful resource and tool for him to promote his trade.
The house walls are 5 courses of brick, and the walls vary between 17 and 24 inches thick.
He did a fine job in crafting the brick, and he needed an equally fine design to show off his brick, and that's why he ended up with a really good example of a side gable version of the Italianate. The signature element in that design, in his particular case, was the paired brackets along the eaves, very deep eaves, heavy brackets that embellished the house.
As one would look at the house from the front, I think one of the things people often notice is it's an asymmetrical design. The windows aren't all equally spaced, and one can also understand as they design and build a home, some things come up and opportunities come up. The same thing happened for Oakes when he was building this home.
Mr. Oakes started acquiring property around 1142 and eventually putting together a total of about 30 acres, and that eventually was called Oakes Addition.
When you look at early maps of Iowa City, you find the Oakes Addition was a rather large tract of land. So it's not surprising that his descendants would remain in that area for many, many years to come, and grandchildren and children were visiting that house long into the 20th century.
The Oakses had 5 boys and a daughter. Hiram was the oldest boy, then came Ada, and then Frank, George, John, and Perry.
The older boys had built their lives kind of, I think, away from Iowa City, and one was in Nebraska, and I don't know a lot about those older kids. By the time you have the younger children, which would have been George Wallace Oakes and John and Perry, that's the generation of kids that my relatives knew.
All the boys worked with Mr. Oakes in the brick factory. In 1905, Nicholas Oakes died. His funeral was here at the house. He's buried in Oakland Cemetery.
In many respects, we could look at Nicholas Oakes and say that he was part of the nouveau riche. He was able to take the small amount of capital he had and make himself even wealthier for future generations, including his 2 sons, who perpetuated the business for 58 years.
The younger boys, John and Perry, eventually built houses and lived next door to this house, to 1142. And John and Perry helped their dad run the brick and tile factory and then later the oil business.
Nicholas's son, John P. Oakes, remained very close to his family home, living next door. It's said that he often played cards with Grant Wood, and his daughter Faye was known to look out her bedroom window and watch Grant paint in the 2nd story of his home, including the painting Parson Weems' Fable. Mary Oakes lived till 1907, 2 years after Nicholas died, and she was about 76 years old at that time. She had made her home on East Court Street for many years, as that part of the city known as Oakes Addition came from her husband, Nicholas Oakes.
Nicholas left the house to Mary, then Mary left the house to George and Fanny.
At that point, my understanding is that their son George Wallace Oakes, lived and owned and maintained the house after that. George was a tall, thin man, described as blue eyes and very dark hair, who apparently followed his father into the business and worked here, died at age 49, died relatively young.
And Fanny stayed on for another 10 years until she sold 1142 in 1920 to developers. Faye Oakes Cruz, the granddaughter of Nicholas and Mary, had told me in various conversations that some strange things were done to the house. The beautiful Italianate porch was torn off, and a fairly ugly squarish porch was put in its place. The beautiful walnut banister in the front stairway was taken off but stored in the barn. The shutters were removed and were used to make chicken coops. And she said in her transcript, I quote, "It was a mess, it was just a mess." And that's the way Grant Wood found it.
Whoever knows who's going to become a famous artist or who's going to make their mark on history. And I don't think Grant Wood ever thought that would be him.
Grant Wood grew up on a farm, and I think the great event of his childhood, and in some ways the deciding event of his life, was when his father died when he was 10 years old.
But when his father died very unexpectedly and suddenly, he and his family moved with his mother and the other 3 children. They moved to Cedar Rapids.
And Grant Wood ended up being much more Cedar Rapids than, where he was born and bred. Nevertheless, he never left where he was born and bred. He never left that farm.
And it was in Cedar Rapids that he began to get some training in the arts during his schooling there in the Cedar Rapids school system.
I was awfully shy and bashful. Why, even in high school as a senior, I could hardly read aloud before others, but I could make a painting, and that would do the talking for me.
In the early 1920s, Grant Wood made his livelihood as a teacher of art in a middle school in Cedar Rapids. This took a lot of time for him, and his output was affected by having to put so much time into teaching. And David Turner made it possible for him to stop teaching by giving him a home, or giving him a place to live that he could fix up and live in, and then he could produce, hopefully in this home, more art than he'd been able to do as a teacher. He decorated it with really built-ins because it was so small, and there's all kinds of little ingenious features of this home that he created that the word went out in Cedar Rapids that he was kind of a magician.
Finally, he landed the commission to do the Veterans Memorial Building, and that stretched Grant Wood even more. And to fabricate the window, it took him to Munich. That gave Grant Wood an opportunity to look at the paintings in the Alte Pinakothek, work with these craftsmen, and when he came back, he thought he would try this new painting style, and he painted a woman with plants. And he entered that in some competitions and got some awards. Didn't get into the Art Institute's annual American Paintings exhibition next year. He painted American Gothic.
No one had ever heard of Grant Wood at that point. They didn't know what this painting was all about, but it struck everybody's fancy as having something to do with sort of core American values or people. So before he knew what had happened to him, he had become a national name.
He captured a quality of America that no one had captured before. So it's a painting that still is probably the most reproduced and parodied painting in the history of American art.
He came here in the winter of 1934 as the new Iowa head of what was called the PWAP, the Public Works of Art Project, which was a brand new New Deal program. So that brought him to campus in the spring of 1934, and he was then given essentially a regular faculty position at the end of that semester.
And of course he had no advanced degrees of any sort and didn't have that kind of academic background, but he was a famous artist.
The Iowa idea was really about creativity and the arts and writing. And those things that people had placed a lot of value on, but really had never tried to teach, really had never tried to do advanced work in any meaningful way.
The University of Iowa pioneered the Master of Fine Arts degree. And prior to this, people who worked in the performing arts, the creative arts, the visual arts, and so forth, they would take degrees in other fields.
And the Master of Fine Arts, the advanced degrees in arts and creativity, really came about because of the work that Grant Wood did here and many people around Grant at the time did similar kinds of work. Whoever thought that hiring an artist with really no academic training to be on our faculty was a good idea?
I went to church one Sunday and my friend asked me, would you like to work at Iowa City? And I said, sure. So I said, where would I work? And she said, at Grant Woods. My name is Mendel Bushart. I'm from Moyland, Iowa. Grant Wood was married 4 years in his life, and he had gotten married in 1935. And this was in 1937. And he was in the process of having a divorce.
Grant Wood married in 1935. He married Sarah Maxson, someone who had been a caretaker for his mother.
They actually married in Minneapolis, and then they moved to Iowa City and bought their big house and launched into life in Iowa City.
I'm Willis Guthrie. I knew Grant Wood as a student from 1939 to 1942. I became acquainted with working on his house on Court Street in Iowa City.
He gave me a palette of 4 colors, knowing, I guess, that I couldn't have 8 colors, I couldn't afford 8 colors. And so then he said, if you will come to my place at Easter break, I'll give you a job working around the yard and you can get some money for more brushes. So that's how I got started with that.
I see. So you would go to Court Street, and what kind of chores did he have you working on?
The first chores, I was up on a ladder, extension ladder, putting sticky fly paper around the brackets that hold the shutters up there, so the birds couldn't sit on there and soil the bricks.
He liked to be surrounded by people. And when he lived in Cedar Rapids, he lived in 5 Turner Alley, which was not a very big space. And his mother and his sister lived there with him from time to time. And then he moved down to 1142, and he had this big house compared to little 5 Turner Alley. But he always had people in the house. He lived here with his wife for a few years. His mother lived here for a while. His son-in-law and daughter-in-law lived here with their child for a period of time.
It was Dorothy Maxson. Sherman Maxson was the son-in-law. In '39, he got his divorce, and then they had to move.
But then he had people living upstairs. He had Eric Knight, who wrote the Lassie Come Home stories, lived upstairs in an apartment that Grant Wood had configured upstairs.
He bought the house in Court Street, soon after coming to the University of Iowa. At that point, it was an extremely dilapidated condition, and he put a lot of his income into fixing it up and a lot of his effort.
The house was very demanding in terms of furnishing it and also doing the restoration.
1142 is very interesting because, remember, Grant Wood built homes for a living. He studied Gustav Stickley's The Craftsman magazine assiduously. So then to come to Iowa City as an accomplished artist, famous artist, to live in this grandiose home, it was palatial to him.
He himself considered that the restoration of the house was one of his masterpieces, on a par with, one of his major paintings.
1142 is a work of art itself. Just like Grant Wood's studio, 5 Turner Alley, it's like walking into Grant Wood's world.
In regard to his working process, he did work in many different media, and there are pictures of him in the Court Street house in the basement with hammer and chisel in hand working on a sculpture. He often wore his overalls to do so, sometimes without a shirt, and usually cigarette in mouth.
One of his revenue streams was in creating lithographs. These lithographs were done for Associated American Artists, and they did it as a mail-order business. You didn't have to necessarily go to New York and go to the gallery to buy one. You could actually buy it through the mail.
My favorite is this one with the frog. I had that frog in my kitchen in a red kettle all summer. He would come and get it when he was using it and bring it back and then the next day he would get it again. And this fly is hanging on a string, but it still would move, or the frog would move, so it took all summer to get finished with them. He painted those up in the kitchen. And then when it went toward Christmas time, he brought me 4 cards to send to anybody I wanted to. So I sent them all to myself.
I met Grant Wood at the age of 7 in the university swimming pool for men. He was naked, my father was naked, and I was naked. That's not the way it is these days, but back in 1937, that's the way it was. And I lived in Iowa City, went to the University Elementary School. As I say, my father ran the University Theater. Grant Wood spoke to my father and said, "Vance, I would like to have you and your son, Jimmy, pose in a painting I want to do."
Parson Weems' Fable is the painting that we all associate with the Court Street house because it was painted there. It was a large painting, and it was a painting that kind of announced that Grant Wood was back in the painting business.
And what we're seeing is the famous story of George Washington cutting down the cherry tree, in which he, as a young boy, apparently cut down one of his father's prized cherry trees, and when confronted with the fact, he famously said, "Father, I cannot tell a lie. Yes, I did do that." And it's always been held up as a lesson for young children. Honesty is the best policy, and tell the truth. But it's also a fable.
We had to strike the pose that he had in his mind that he wanted to do in the painting, but we didn't have a hatchet. But Grant Wood said, "Well, here's a hammer. You hold that." And they didn't have a cherry tree, but they did have a long iron pole of about 8 feet long. And so my father held the pole, 9 feet pole, and I, standing opposite him, held the offending hatchet in my right hand, and we were photographed. And that is the second time I got to know Grant Wood.
Parson Weems's Fable actually shows this house, and clearly it's a painting of Parson Weems, who made up the story about George Washington and the cherry tree. It's a painting that's full of sly references about what's true and false in American history. He's imagining himself as Parson Weems creating fables for the American public.
Grant Wood worked 22 hours in one stretch to finish the painting Parson Weems' Fable. It will go on display in the Whitney Museum January 10, 1940.
I remember hearing that he'd painted all night on the hand, but he had it setting up in his living room and brought me in to see it. And I didn't have anything I could even suggest or tell him about. I just kind of stood there looking at it. And I also was very careful about what I was going to say about his painting.
It was the first major painting he'd done in some time.
Yeah. And of course I was impressed with the house they represented, which was the one I'd been working around on.
I think it's just so important that he painted the house in with that. He was always painting himself into these works. This time, instead of painting a variation of his own face into the thing, he painted his house.
And it was bought up right away by John Marquardt, the writer. So it became another kind of big moment for Grant Wood.
I think that I saw the painting 6 or 8 months later, totally done, complete painting. So my mother and father's response to the painting was, they knew Grant Wood personally, and his stuff was all very homey. You know, lots of paintings of vegetables and potted plants and what have you. And this was also a kind of homey painting. And they loved it, but they weren't very surprised by it. The only surprising thing was seeing my mother's husband and her son in it.
One day he come in the kitchen and he said, Mendel, would you mind posing for me for a picture? And I took me by surprise, and I thought a little bit, and I said, well, will anybody recognize me? He said, oh no, I'll make so nobody recognizes you. So I thought, okay, I will. So I posed for him. And then he took my picture too, and used that, you know. So, but he didn't get that picture, it's just on brown paper. He became ill, and I think he didn't want to work on that, so he went up to his summer cottage, and then when he came back, he went to the hospital. And
what people often say about Grant Wood in the late 30s is that he often had periods of depression. So life was a struggle. He also was having some political and sort of ideological problems with the university. And not everybody thought American regionalism was the style of the future. So he had to really kind of fight for his turf in the university by the late 30s. And he wasn't a fighter. He was a gentle person. And from what I hear from people, this was pretty rough on his psyche. And he had to very often take some time out.
At the same moment, almost, they're realizing he is suffering from cancer. And it's inevitable.
In his old, roomy Iowa City house, where his principal hobby was gardening, he lived in dignified semi-retirement, entertained a continual stream of distinguished visitors, shook a gentle fist at Bohemia and the big cities, and preached the gospel of U.S. regionalism and the Iowa soil.
The last pictures he painted were Spring in the Country and Spring in the City, and he painted them in the summer of 1941 in the little studio that he had at Clear Lake. That was the summer before he passed away in February of 42. And I remember his secretary, Spark Reiner, wrote about Grant at one time, and this is what he said. Faith is the strength of simple men, and locked deep within him, Grant Wood had this faith. He believed in the essential goodness of human nature and in the existence of a power for good and order beyond this life. This faith he painted into his pictures, into the idealized patterns of the landscape, and in the grim and strong human characters that he painted.
I remember her telling me, you know, Rye, when I walked in the door the first time of this house, I knew I was at home.
Pauline Moore bought 1142 from Grant Wood's estate and moved her family here, her husband Ed Miltner and the two children, Tom and Raya.
Mother, she was a pistol. She was so funny. She could really be really funny. And I can remember one thing about her, if you got her laughing, she would laugh until the tears would be rolling down her face. Yeah, it was, she was something. Extremely, extremely smart. But she didn't act like it. Do you know what I mean? She was still, underneath all of that, a very poor West Branch, Iowa country girl. My grandparents had an 80-acre farm, which 80 acres doesn't grow much, so they were very, very poor. I know my mom said they used to eat popcorn for breakfast if they could grow it.
Pauline Moore was married to Ed Miltner, and Ed was a clothing store operator in Iowa City.
He was a very kind man, very kind man.
I had a mustache, and he was very tall, and he always dressed impeccably.
She and my dad were quite the pair, her at 5'2" and my father at 6'2". And they were engaged 7 years before they got married. They waited until she finished medical school in 1930. And then they got married, like a month after. June 9th, 1930, they were married. She practiced medicine under her maiden name because that's what's was on her diploma. For some things, she used the name Miltner. For instance, when they bought 1142, the paperwork shows Pauline V. Miltner.
She had wonderfully long hair, and it was always up in a bun, always. And she said it was very easy to take care of. She had no time for beauticians, as she said, or anything. She had to get to the hospital. She had to, do her work, and it was very easy that way. So she was very, very pretty, and she always walked fast.
She was a very interesting, delightful person. She had a very distinctive voice. It was, again, a precise voice, and she had precise articulation, and she always let you know that she was answering your question and let's get on with things. She moved at her own pace.
She used to drive a great big Cadillac, just modest makeup and always dressed very nicely, and she just sort of stomp down the halls, and she was a woman of action. Couldn't help but admire her.
She had one dress when she went through medical school, and she did not tell her mother that she was going to medical school because Grandma that was unheard of. You just didn't do anything like that. So she didn't tell her mother for a long time that she was in medical school. And she started her practice in Solon.
Pauline, at that time, was a very prominent physician, family practice physician in Iowa City. And back then, family practice physicians did a lot. I mean, they delivered babies and they did surgeries, and Pauline did all of those things.
She made house calls, but when she really did it the most, though, was in the wintertime, and be literally in a sleigh going through across and over fences and everything else to get to her patients. But winters back then in Iowa were horrendous.
She told me that early in her practice, she made house calls, of course, all the time, and she drove out into the country with her Model A coupe, and she carried a loaded revolver under the seat of her car in case of marauders who might jump out of the roadside.
And I know this is unbelievable, but an office visit was $3. And if a person couldn't afford to pay, if they could afford medical insurance, she asked them to do medical insurance, and then she would personally not charge them. And a lot of people, we ate really well because a lot of her patients could not pay. And so we got eggs and chickens and, produce, sweet corn, tomatoes by the bushel. That would be how they could pay, which was fine with her.
Pauline told me herself that she had delivered 5,000 babies in her practice in Iowa City. And of course, part of the reason for that heavy practice was because she practiced during the Second World War, and many of the male physicians went off to war, and she stayed here.
And the 5,000th one was my oldest daughter, Lisa, and then she retired. Dad had a clothing store, and she did that, and they had Tom and I. Tom came along in 1942, so he was he came along in 1940. He was 2 years old when they moved into the house, and of course I lived there until I was 18 when I graduated.
I always had to fix Tom a peanut butter sandwich for school. That's all he wanted was a peanut butter sandwich. He kind of went with the style sometimes with his hair. He had kind of a duck tail or something in the back, and the style. And one time he must have went to the hairdressers and got his hair peroxide or something and had it kind of white in the front. Dr. Moore made him go back and get it colored. She didn't stand up for that.
I always liked that yard. I always liked it. Parts of it had sort of a English country cottage feel where my folks had planted irises and peonies and things like that. It was just really fantastic.
just thought it was a nice old house. Above the fireplace, she had a big picture of Marvin Cohn's painting.
She often said that the reason she had the Marvin Cohn painting over the fireplace of the barn and the chickens is because she said, yes, this is my way of bringing the farm to my house. And where the swimming pool is where Aunt Pauline had this marvelous garden that was sort of a miniature facsimile of what was out on the farm she grew up on, the 80 acres where she grew up north of West Branch. And she had rhubarb, maybe green beans, just some typical vegetable crops, you know, but a small amount. And so she would come home from the hospital, and of course not with her lab coat, but she would be wearing nice clothing, and she would go right to the backyard and start weeding. And I can remember walking around the side of the house and seeing her just throwing weeds around.
She loved the house at 1142. Loved it.
That house was fantastic. It was the brick and these grand staircase that we'd go up to the second floor and just look around. And the furniture in this house was phenomenal. There was a big piano that was probably 12 feet long, and it looked like it would take probably 4 or 5 guys to move it if they had wanted to move it. And all of the furniture in that house was massive. It was handsome and gorgeous.
When I first met Pauline, it was the night I moved into the carriage house. I was renting the carriage house from Pauline and Ed, and I had just filed a lawsuit against the University of Iowa hospitals, and Pauline was working at that time at Student Health. And Ed said, "Would you like to meet Dr. Moore?" He called her Dr. Moore. And "Would you like to meet Dr. Moore?" And I said, "Well, sure." So I walked from the carriage house into this room, and Pauline was sitting in the middle of the living room watching television. And Ed said, "Pauline, would you like to meet Jim Hayes?" And she said, she never turned to look at me, and she said, "I know who Jim Hayes is." And I thought, oh my gosh, I better get the heck out of here. So I went back up to the carriage house, and within about 15 minutes, she and Ed were at my door with a bottle of scotch and a bottle of bourbon and some glasses and some ice. And they came upstairs and we poured some drinks, and she sat down next to me at the kitchen counter, and she said, "All right, tell me about this Jim Speed case." And of course, Jim Speed was the basketball player who had been blinded at the university in Student Health. And she sat, and I told her the story, and by the time we were finished talking about the story, she was best friends with me, and she taught me all I was to learn about anatomy and about medicine for my very first case. She gave me all of her surgical books. She gave me all of her medical books, which I still have here in the library.
My parents loved Jim, just loved him to death. And he was very good to them. He was very nice to them. So it worked out very well for all concerned.
And she kept asking me she wanted me to buy the house after Ed died because it was too much for her to take care of. And so I spent some time with her during those discussions. And then Ed died, and she moved away from 1142. Pauline moved into an apartment, and then eventually she remarried and bought a house over in University Heights.
Pauline Moore, who owned the 1142, when Jim won a big legal case, she wanted to move on, and Jim Hayes was living in the carriage house. And she gave him a real fast deadline on buying the house, which he did.
I really didn't have any money to buy the house. It was a gorgeous house and big history. But one day, on the front page of the Des Moines Register was a report that I had won this major case, and it was a high-profile case, And Dr. Moore came into my office with the newspaper and she said, well, now you can buy my house. Don't tell me that you can't buy my house now. October of 1975, I bought the house and moved in.
1, 2, 3, go!
Being Irish is very important to our family now and always was. We had great pride in being Irish.
On the Hayes side of the family, my great-grandparents moved to the States in 1861. The same farmstead in County Limerick, which was our home county in Ireland, is still in existence, and I still have Hayes cousins who live in the same farmstead.
Morrissey's came from Illinois, and the Hayeses came from southern Iowa. Grandpa Hayes went up north before they got married in the 19th century and plowed out his homestead. He went north along the railroad track that ran from Traer with a wagon frame, no box, just the running gear, and himself and a team of horses and a plow tied onto it.
By this time, my mother's family was in the same area near Forest City.
Grandpa and Grandma Morrissey moved to Forest City from Genesee, Illinois, and that's when they became friends with the Hayes family. And then they were very close because they were Catholics, first of all, but they got to know them, and then they lived quite nearby. My mother was probably about 14. Grandpa Morrissey was very, very ill, and it was Grandpa Hayes and our dad, too, who helped the Morrissey girls, Nita and Alice and Bertha, their mother, keep the farm going.
So my mom and dad met after the Morrissey family moved near the Hayes family. And they got married and lived on the old place where I was born, lived there until I was about, I think, 4, and my brother was 6 or 7 years old. And they completely lost everything then to the insurance companies after the Depression. And they bought the farm where I then went through grade school and high school.
And we grew up in a town called Forest City, Iowa. Wonderful town. It's largely made up of Norwegians and Swedish people, all wonderful people, and we really were minorities. I mean, they did look at, askance at us once in a while, like, who are these people?
So I grew up on a farm west of Forest City and then south of Forest City. And we grew up with a lot of animals, a lot of horses. My dad used to race trotting horses, and we always had horses around from the time I was a little kid. Dad and Mom had gone through the Depression, and they were cash on the barrelhead people. And he decided that if the price of corn went down, he wanted some oats. If the price of oats went down, he wanted some hogs, and that's kind of the way they lived their life.
So growing up was just beautiful. We had our animals, we had beautiful horses, dogs, and growing up, both Jim and I were in 4-H. So Jim would show beautiful Angus cattle.
I suppose at 8 or 9 or 10, I was responsible for the lives of animals and for doing important things to help the farm work.
And it was hard work. Dad was up at 4:30 in the morning and worked till 9 at night. And the boys had to be right out there working with him. And they even though they were never going to be farmers, they learned the farming skills. I mean, we were all expected to work hard in the farm.
Everybody was hardworking. The folks, they didn't drill it into us to be hardworking, but everybody around us was. It was the example that that's what you did, and to be real honest, and never to think you're better than someone.
Education was always probably number one, but there was always a concern about being good to people who had less, and being fair and showing equality to everyone. And those are the lessons that I learned from my family.
And our school was small. I think Jim's class and my class were both maybe around 60 to 70 students, so we knew everybody. So we had wonderful experience in school. We had band. Jim, by the way, was first chair trumpet. And our older brother played the drums. And then I played the flute, and my sister played the French horn. But it also exemplifies how we were reared. And there was a big band outing. All the band members were going somewhere for some big trip. And my father became ill. He had some serious health problems along the way, and they had to bring the crops in. And so Mom drove the 2 miles to town. Jim was just ready to get on the school bus, and she said, Jim, you have to come home to help. And he was just, okay, because that's the way we did it when we were growing up.
And my parents, they were intent on making sure that the 4 of us all went to college. We had a wonderful family member, Monsignor Norbert Barrett was the Dean of Men at Loras College. It was a men's Catholic school in Dubuque, Iowa. And there was never a question of really where Denny and I were going to go to school, I guess, because Norbert said the boys are going to go to Loras, so we both graduated from Loras.
And there was no question whether you were going to college or not. It was just where. So we all had jobs. During the year we did not, because we all worked at home and worked on our studies. But every summer we had jobs. Jim had various jobs in between his high school years and college as well.
After I graduated from college and I started law school, my first job was working for a sewer construction company. And it was very, very hard work, and it was work mostly at the bottom of a 22-foot hole, and I never saw daylight for 10 or 12 hours. Take my lunch down with me, take food down with me, and only come out to go to the bathroom once in a while. But the rest of the time I was like a mole down under the railroad tracks. And some very close calls. We were putting in new manholes, and I'd been jackhammering for an hour probably. And the foreman came and got me. Come with me, Hayes, you're going to a different site. And so I got out, jumped into his truck, got a block or so down the road, heard this explosion, and the manhole exploded with the new guy that took my place. And he was killed in the explosion. It was sewer gas, and a spark from the jackhammer had lit this explosion. So I was very lucky indeed to get, but it paid my way through law school. So.
I've known Jim for over 50 years. He came to the law school when I was early in my career at the law school teaching, and he was a student of mine. And he's the kind of person that once you get to know, you know him always, and you're always glad to see him.
Well, I came to Iowa City to be a trial lawyer with Bill Meredon. He asked me to come and do that with his office. And I met Mike Seelig about this time.
I was playing as a sophomore and I was quarterback at Iowa and playing over at Northwestern, and they beat us up pretty bad that day. And my mother was there with my father and met Jim in the stands. They were sitting by each other at the game. And I remember my mother coming home and saying, I met this wonderful guy, he's just like one of the Kennedys. And so then Jim started, she was very active in politics, as was Jim. And so Jim started coming up to our house on Brown Street and just spending time with my mother, really. And then eventually got to know Jim through my mother, and I agreed. He was just a neat guy to get to know. And then when I signed with the Browns, I was drafted in the 6th round by the Cleveland Browns, and Jim was my attorney, or I knew him as an attorney, and so rather than hiring an agent, I used Jim as my attorney to represent me for contract negotiations with the Browns.
That started a new niche in my practice. I only negotiated and charged on an hourly basis. I didn't ever take a percentage because it was always my belief that they had worked very, very hard to get to the point they were, and they were going to get a certain amount of money anyway. But if I could help them get a little bit more through my hard work, then that's what I would charge them for. I suppose over those 17 years that people I represented made up maybe 10% of my practice.
You know, I needed legal representation, not so much to contract, you know, the money side of it, but more the legal side of it, and that's why I chose Jim, and that kind of got him started into that field for a while before he got into medical malpractice.
We're probably one of the very few places in Iowa that are kind of a boutique medical malpractice firm for plaintiffs, because most people, the nature of that is difficult, and most people don't want to do that all the time.
One of the cases with which I was involved had to do with a wonderful athlete at the University of Iowa. His name was Jim Speed. He came here in 1970. He had 85 scholarship offers from universities and colleges. It was testified later that he was the best basketball player in America for the next 5 years. So he was here from June until November, and then he contracted a sinus infection, and our allegation was that over a 5-day period of time, he did not receive the proper treatment, and he became blinded.
I mean, here's a young guy, and it was completely preventable. That's a tough story, and I think that you know, he fought so hard in that case, and you know, you got to give him credit because it was his first big case, and he took it to the wire because he felt like that was the right thing to do.
Before Jim Speed, the rule was that only a local doctor could testify against another doctor. In this case, because the university was a tertiary care center and had doctors from all over the world practicing at this really wonderful hospital, we were able to convince the judge that we should be able to bring in outside experts because everybody in tertiary care centers learned the same thing. All doctors learned the same thing from the same schools, from the same books, that sort of thing.
I think most people in this profession appreciate that decision maybe more than any other.
And so that case to this day is still being talked about and still taught at the College of Medicine and at the College of Law. And so Jim Speed has had this huge impact on thousands and thousands of medical students and lawyers.
Knowing Jim Speed before he died, what a remarkable guy. I mean, never bitter a day in his life and counted Jim Hayes as one of his best friends. You know, we talk about it now about people having access to the court system. That's this kind of case. I mean, it provided someone an avenue for justice that didn't exist before that.
One of my friends, Tom Spile, who was also a friend of Mike Selig's, was the head athletic trainer for the University of Iowa athletic program. Tom was one of the people who was involved in taking Jim Speed to the doctor. And after he was blinded, I talked frequently with Tom Spile about what had happened. Tom and his wife Nancy were good friends of mine. They had 2 little kids, Tommy and Susie. And then 2 years after Jim Speed was blinded, Tom became very ill with a sinus infection himself. And over a 30-day period of time, Tom got worse and worse, and he eventually died. I was there with him when he died, but he had asked before he died if I would help take care of the 2 little kids. Well, as I said, Tommy was 2 and Susie was 4. And so I did, and helped take care of them, and I've helped raise them. I was there for them when they went to college and gone to ball games and taken kids to school and the whole thing. And they're a big part of my life. They've been a big part of this house of 1142. They had bedrooms in the house. They stayed here. We had parties here. Tommy's 10th birthday party was initiated the new swimming pool. So they've been a big part of my life. 1142 in the future, as I envision it, the whole property, when we talk about 1142, means that the properties behind the house are incorporated into this complex. But that constitutes the Grant Wood Art Colony, and that's already been started through the School of Art and Art History at the University of Iowa.
I can see that this could emerge over time into a national center, not only for the study of Grant Wood, but for the study of place and region. Just as Grant Wood sought on a number of occasions in his own lifetime to create these communities of artists and writers and intellectuals, he seemed to want to gather people around him or be a part of a larger community of people that were interested in making the most of their time and place and their identity as Americans, and I think that's what this could be.
It's already famous within the United States. The programs like this are rare, and we have one. We'd like to build on that reputation. I think we'd also like to have it become more interdisciplinary, so taking advantage of all the arts. How that gets done, the details, it remains to be seen, but we've been fortunate to have Jim involved in these early stages with his imagination and his help to get it to the point we are now.
Think about how Jim Hayes has worked hard to create a meaningful and lasting legacy in Grant Wood's name. That too will contribute in a major way to the community here, in terms of arts, in terms of the artists' colony that will spring up around that beautiful home, and in terms of the events that the university will likely host in that home from now until eternity, really.
In its almost 160-year history, 1142 has seen a lot of history unfold and evolve. Many friends and families have come through the property. Celebrities and artists when Grant Wood lived here, politicians, all a part of this welcoming and gathering of 1142. So I'm very, very happy that someday I will turn over 1142 to the University of Iowa so that 1142, the Grant Wood Art Colony, all of the surrounding complex of 1142 will live on. Live on as a living legacy to frontier spirit, to friendship, to families, and to artistic creativity.